God's chosen ones. Death can't touch you. Not until you fulfill this assignment. You were not sent here to die. You were sent here to finish. What if the reason you're still breathing is because heaven never released you? Maybe you thought it was a close call, a near crash, a quiet breakdown, a prayer that barely escaped your lips. But what if it was more than that? What if the moment that should have ended you was actually the moment God marked you? That ache you carry, it's not weakness, it's a whisper from the divine. That pressure in your chest, it's not anxiety, it's eternity calling your name. And that sense that you're still here for some reason you can't explain. It's not coincidence, it's covenant. You don't need another motivational message. You need a spiritual mirror. So lean in, because before your lungs took their first breath, before your name was ever spoken on earth, God looked at your life and declared, "She will finish. He will not die until it is done." And if you're God's chosen one, this message was written in heaven with your name on it. The moment you almost quit was the moment heaven tightened its grip. Her name was Grace, and for a while that name felt like a cruel joke, because for the last few years life had felt more like survival than sanctification, more like wandering than walking in purpose. She lived in a small town where nothing ever changed, the kind of place with peeling white churches, lonely front porches, and mailboxes that leaned like tired old men. The streets were quiet, but her soul was not. Some nights, she would wake up gasping, not from a dream, but from a silence so loud it felt like punishment. She had once known the voice of God, or thought she did. Now, she wasn't so sure. There was a time she'd sing worship songs while doing dishes, pray for strangers in grocery aisles, and feel the presence of God just by sitting under the oak tree in her backyard. But after the divorce, the sickness, the miscarried dream, something went quiet inside her. And yet, she hadn't died. She hadn't disappeared. That's what bothered her most. She wasn't thriving, but she was still here, still waking up, still walking, still standing, and that question followed her like a shadow. Why am I still here? She didn't ask it out loud, but heaven heard it anyway. And on one dusky afternoon, standing in the wind-licked field behind her house, with a journal in her hand and tears she couldn't explain, she whispered, "God, I don't understand. Why didn't you let me go?" And just as the wind shifted, the words came, not from her mouth, not from her memory, but from somewhere deeper, because it's not finished. That was the first crack in the silence. She felt it in her bones, like fire under snow, like light pressing against a locked door. And suddenly, everything she thought was punishment began to look like preservation. The accident that didn't kill her, the heartbreak that didn't consume her, the nights she thought she was alone but somehow made it through. They weren't random. They were reminders. Heaven had not released her because heaven still required her. She was not forgotten. She was not overlooked. She was on assignment. And in that holy hush, Grace heard the clearest truth she'd ever known. You cannot die until you finish what I sent you here to do. Part 1. Before you had a name, you had a calling. Before you had a calling. Alejandra, a small-town church attic, sunlight streaming through stained glass dust. The attic smelled like cedar and old communion wine. The church had been closed for years, but Grace still had the keys, a gift from the old pastor before he moved to Georgia. It was where she used to play hide-and-seek with the Holy Spirit as a child, tucked between boxes of hymnals and forgotten pew cushions. On that particular morning, something pulled her back. Not nostalgia, not curiosity, a summons. She brushed past the cobwebs and climbed the creaky steps. The silence up there wasn't hollow, it was thick, sacred. And then she saw it. An old Bible, leather-worn, tabs sticking out like whispered prayers. Her grandmother's name, Viola Bennett, written in blue ink that had faded with time, but not with power. She opened it, and out slipped a yellowed piece of paper. A prayer, handwritten in slanted cursive. Lord, set her apart before the world calls her anything else. Let her know she's yours before she learns to doubt it. Grace clutched it like a lifeline. Tears fell, but she didn't wipe them. She let them baptize her again. Suddenly she remembered the day her grandmother whispered into her ear at age 6. Baby girl, before you had a name, you had a calling. God spoke you into the world, not just to live in it, but to change it. At the time, it sounded like a fairy tale, but standing there now, the memory felt more real than the floor beneath her. She flipped to Jeremiah 1:5 and her breath caught in her throat. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. She didn't just read it, it read her. And in that attic, filled with dust, silence, and memory, she finally understood. Her origin wasn't the hospital she was born in. It wasn't the small town printed on her birth certificate. It wasn't even her parents' story. Her life began in the mind of God. Before heartbreak, before failure, before shame ever attached itself to her identity. She had already been chosen, not by people, but by the one who formed galaxies with a whisper. And he didn't just know her. He appointed her, not to a title, owing to a platform, but to a purpose no one else could carry. She dropped to her knees, not from grief, but from weight.
The weight of knowing I was never random. Even the parts she had hated, her shyness, her sensitivity, the way she felt too much in every room, were all by design. Her quirks weren't flaws. They were fingerprints, evidence of a creator who had sketched her soul with the precision of an artist and the tenderness of a father. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't ask, why me? She whispered, thank you for not forgetting what you put in me. In that attic, dusty and quiet, destiny was reawakened, and Grace stood up with something she hadn't carried in years. Not just hope, but remembrance.
Part 2. The pain wasn't punishment, it was preparation. Grace's kitchen, dim morning light through sheer curtains, a kettle on the stove. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual. Grace sat at the table with her journal open, staring at the steam rising from a chipped mug of tea. Pages of scribbled prayers and raw confessions stared back at her, each one a chapter of a life she wasn't proud of, but couldn't escape. Betrayal, abandonment, loss after loss. She used to think it was because she'd done something wrong, like she was cursed or marked for misery. Why does everything I touch fall apart? She'd written once, 3 years ago to the day. She flipped through pages filled with old entries that read more like obituaries than reflections. Walked out again. I guess I wasn't enough. Miscarriage 2. I didn't even let myself dream this time. I'm tired of asking God why he keeps breaking what's left of me. Grace let out a hollow laugh, not because it was funny, but because somehow, after all that, she was still here. Not numb, not whole, but breathing. And then a thought emerged, not hers, but higher. What if I wasn't punishing you? What if I was preparing you? She closed her eyes and let the questions sit. Because deep down, part of her had always believed her pain was proof that she'd failed. That God had stepped back when she made too many mistakes. But now she felt something different. What if the fire wasn't judgment? What if it was forging? She remembered the night she sat alone on the floor, crying into a towel so no one would hear. The time she looked at a bottle of pills and felt like disappearing. And the days she couldn't pray, so she just whispered, God, help. What if those moments weren't signs she'd fallen from grace, but moments she'd fallen into it? She got up and opened the back door. The cold morning air kissed her face like a breath from heaven. She whispered the prayer she never thought she'd say again. Lord, if all that pain was on purpose, don't let it be wasted. Suddenly, memories flashed, not just of the pain, but of how it shaped her. The way she could now spot heartbreak in other people's eyes. How she instinctively knew when someone was lying because she used to lie too, about being fine. How she could sit with someone in their lowest moment and not flinch because she knew what it was like to be there and not have anyone stay. The scars didn't make her disqualified. They made her dangerous to darkness. She remembered the verse, "He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion."
And for the first time, she believed it applied to her. Not the version of her who got it all right. The version of her who sat at that table, unshowered, heart sore, still tender from old wounds. That version still had purpose. That version still had breath. And heaven wasn't asking her to be healed before obeying. Heaven was asking her to surrender while she healed. She looked down at the journal and picked up her pen. Today, I stopped calling it punishment. Today, I started calling it preparation. And as the pen glided across the paper, a tear fell, not from grief, but from the sacred recognition that the wilderness she'd walked through hadn't been wasted. It had been woven.
Part 3. You are protected by your purpose. A hospital chapel during a storm. The storm hit just before noon. A flash flood had closed the highway, and Grace, on her way to visit a friend, found herself detouring through a part of town she hadn't seen in years. Her tires skidded slightly on the wet pavement as the light turned red. She braked hard. In those split seconds, time slowed. She remembered the car crash from years ago, the way metal twisted, the silence after impact, the confusion, the blood. But this time, the car stopped. Just in time. She gripped the steering wheel, heart pounding, lungs heaving, but she was fine. Too shaken to drive further, she parked near a hospital and went inside just to breathe. She wandered, numb, until she found herself in a small chapel tucked between two waiting rooms. The air was still. Soft worship music played in the background. She sat in the back pew and exhaled. Why am I still here, she thought again. Not bitterly, just honestly. And then an old man, frail but kind, sat beside her. Though the chapel was empty, he didn't look at her, just whispered, "You ever wonder why certain things didn't kill you?" She froze. He wasn't asking rhetorically. He was answering something she hadn't said out loud. He continued, "Sometimes God protects what he still intends to use, not because you're better, but because the assignment ain't finished." Grace looked at him, eyes wide, but he just smiled faintly and stared at the stained glass window ahead. Then he added, "When purpose is still active, even death must wait its turn." She felt it, deep in her chest. It was like a lock inside her spirit had just clicked open. She whispered, "Who are you?" But when she turned, the man was gone. No footsteps, no door creak. Just the scent of myrrh and the memory of his words. Even death must wait its turn. She broke down right there in the pew, but this time it wasn't grief. It was reverence. Because in that moment she understood. The reason that depression didn't kill her, the reason the diagnosis reversed, the reason she walked away from that accident years ago, it wasn't luck.
Wasn't coincidence. It was divine protection because purpose was still alive. And not just any purpose. Her purpose. Specific, wholly non-transferable. God had not kept her alive to simply exist. We had kept her alive to complete things, and no matter how tired, how lost, how far off course she felt, the assignment still stood. He hadn't revoked the mission. He had preserved her for it. She lifted her face, tears still falling, and said it out loud this time. "Thank you for not letting me die before I finish what you sent me to do." Lightning cracked outside, but inside, peace settled like warm oil on her shoulders. She was not invincible, but she was covered by calling, protected by purpose, sealed by something death could not trespass. And that knowledge didn't make her proud. It made her obedient. She stood, steadied herself, and whispered, "Whatever the assignment is, I'm still here. Use me."
Part 4. The attacks came because you're dangerous. Grace's childhood bedroom, dim with memory. The room hadn't changed much. The wallpaper still peeled in the corners. The same dusty bookshelf leaned crooked against the wall, and the stuffed bear on the bed hadn't moved since she left for college. It felt like walking into a time capsule of forgotten hopes and unspoken wounds. She hadn't stepped foot in this room in nearly a decade. Not since her father left without goodbye. Not since the phone call she never got. Not since the words she never heard, except once, in anger. "You'll never be anything, Grace. You're too much trouble." She never admitted how deep that wound had gone. How many times she'd replayed it. How many decisions she'd made from that one lie. She sat on the bed, now as a grown woman, and let herself feel it. All the moments she dimmed her light, so she wouldn't be too much. All the times she chose silence instead of truth, afraid her voice would drive people away. All the gifts she buried, afraid of being mocked or misunderstood. And then God interrupted the spiral with one thunderous truth. The attacks came because you're dangerous. She blinked. Hell doesn't waste its weapons on the weak. The reason you were targeted so young is because you carried something heaven seeded. A sob rose in her throat, not out of sorrow but revelation. Her whole life, she thought, the warfare meant she was cursed. That the rejection meant she was unworthy. That the abandonment meant she was unlovable. But now, the enemy wasn't trying to punish her past. He was terrified of her future, because when she was 7, she saw visions no one explained.
At 11, she wrote prayers that made adults cry. At 15, she felt other people's pain like it was her own. And instead of being nurtured, she was attacked. But now she saw the pattern. Every time she rose, darkness reacted. Why? Because your voice carries authority hell can't counterfeit, whispered the spirit. And suddenly her tears shifted. They weren't just about pain anymore. They were about power. She stood in front of the mirror, the same one she used to avoid, and looked herself in the eyes. No makeup, no armor, no performance. Just the girl who had survived it all. The woman who was still standing. She placed her hand on her chest and declared softly but firmly, "I was not attacked because I was weak. I was attacked because I'm a threat." And heaven echoed back, "And no weapon formed against you will prosper." She stepped out of that room different, not because the wound didn't still ache, but because she now understood what it meant. It was dangerous to darkness, not because of who she used to be, but because of who she was becoming.
Part 5. Your assignment is not a title, it's a life. Grace's front porch at sunrise. The sun was just beginning to rise, brushing golden light across the horizon, like God's own signature on a new day. Grace sat on the wooden porch swing, barefoot, coffee warm in her hands. She wasn't thinking about ministry. She wasn't thinking about calling. She was just breathing. It was one of those rare mornings when everything felt still. The kind of morning where even the birds seemed to sing softer, like they knew the earth needed quiet. And then she saw her, Layla, the teenager from 2 doors down, 17 maybe, shoulders hunched, hoodie pulled tight. She always walked to school alone, head down as if bracing herself against the world. Grace usually just waved, but today something tugged at her spirit. She called out, "Hey, sweetheart, you okay?" The girl froze, startled that someone even noticed. She gave a faint nod, eyes glossy. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "You're the only one who's ever asked." And with that, she walked on. Grace sat frozen. Her heart cracked open with a holy weight. She hadn't given a sermon. She hadn't performed a miracle. She just saw someone, and somehow that was enough. The words echoed in her spirit. Your assignment is not a title. It's a life. Suddenly she remembered what Jesus said. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. He didn't say, let your sermon shine. He didn't say, let your platform shine. He said, light. And light isn't loud, it's presence. She looked at her hands. Same hands that folded laundry. Same hands that comforted strangers. Same hands that wiped her own tears. They were holy because they were available. That moment, a simple smile, a question, a pause, was just as much ministry as anything behind a pulpit. Because ministry wasn't the platform, it was the porch, the presence, the posture. She grabbed a dry eraser marker and walked inside. Wrote a single line on her bathroom mirror. Whatever I do today, Lord, let it reflect you. And she meant it. Whether it was making dinner, helping a neighbor, or holding space for someone on the verge of breaking, it would be her pulpit. And in that sacred surrender, she felt heaven lean in. Because Grace finally understood. Her assignment wasn't to be impressive. It was to be faithful, to carry God into the grocery store, into the classroom, into text messages and traffic jams. To live in such a way that even her silence echoed with light. Part 6. You're still standing because you're not done. A quiet cemetery on her mother's death anniversary. It had been 4 years. 4 years since Grace stood beneath that weeping willow and watched them lower the only woman who ever understood her into the ground. Her mother had always been her compass, soft-spoken but spiritually fierce. Even when Grace drifted from church, from truth, from herself, her mother never stopped praying. Now, with a bouquet of lilies and a letter folded in her coat pocket, Grace walked slowly to the headstone. Rebecca Ann Whitmore. A woman of unshakable faith. She knelt beside the grave, letting the silence wrap around her like a shawl. The letter was old, written in a moment of absolute despair. After a night filled with crying, numbness, and the kind of pain that made life feel optional. I don't know why I'm still here, it began. I feel like I missed the moment I was born for, like whatever God wanted from me expired when I broke. She had never mailed it, never burned it, just tucked it away, until now. As she read the words, she didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She just listened, like reading a note from a stranger who once lived in her skin. She finished it, then looked to the sky. I didn't die, she whispered. I didn't die. And the weight of that truth, 4 words she once said with bitterness, now pulsed with power. Why had she made it through when others didn't? The car crash, the breakdown, the diagnosis that mysteriously reversed, the sleepless nights where her only prayer was a silent scream. She had not survived because she was strong. She had survived because heaven had refused to release her. And that could only mean one thing. She was not done. Not done being light in dark places. Not done being a vessel of healing. Not done carrying something that only she could deliver to the world. The story was still being written. She stood, unfolded the letter one last time, and lifted it to the wind. It danced in the air, dipped, then soared, as if the heavens themselves received it like incense. She smiled through tears and whispered, not to the grave, but to her own soul. You're still standing because you're still assigned. The breeze grew stronger, almost playful, like an echo of her mother's laughter. And for the first time in years, Grace didn't feel like she was surviving her story. She felt like she was stepping back into it. Part 7. Delay was never denial, it was development. A local elementary school classroom. Grace never imagined she'd find herself back in a classroom, especially not as a substitute teacher. But when the principal called last minute, desperate for someone to cover a second-grade class, something in her spirit said yes. The classroom buzzed with crayons and tiny voices. Paper butterflies hung from the ceiling. The desks were sticky with spilled juice and untold stories. Grace had barely written her name on the board before she noticed him. A small boy in the back row, eyes lowered, shoulders curled inward, like he was trying to disappear. His name was Eli. And while the other kids laughed and colored, he stared out the window, silent. She didn't press him. She just watched and waited. By lunch, she had learned from the teacher's aide that Eli had a stutter, that he never spoke in class, that most kids ignored him. Grace felt the ache, not pity, but recognition. She knew what it was like to carry something inside and feel like the world would mock you if you let it out. So after recess, while the rest of the class drew pictures of their pets, she knelt beside Eli's desk and whispered, "You don't have to speak if you're not ready, but I want you to know, I believe there's something special in you." His eyes flicked toward her, unsure. "I used to be scared to speak too," she added, "until I realized my voice was never meant to be hidden." She didn't expect a miracle. But just before the final bell rang, Eli raised his hand. Grace froze. The class did too. She nodded, holding her breath. And then, halting, trembling, he read a sentence from the whiteboard. One sentence. But it was everything. The room went quiet. Then, slowly, applause broke out. Eli blushed. Grace smiled so hard it hurt. After class, as she raised the board, she heard the whisper again. "Delay is not denial. Delay is development." All this time, she thought she'd missed her chance, thought she'd lost the window to be used. But God hadn't been withholding purpose. He had been deepening it, in the unseen, in the silence, in the slow, stretching spaces. Just like Eli's voice had been waiting for the right moment, so had hers. She walked out of that school not just feeling useful, she felt aligned, not performing, not proving, partnering, because the delay had trained her heart for moments like this, moments where she didn't need a mic to minister, just presence and patience and a willingness to show up. Part 8. You were assigned to people, not just tasks. A small-town community center food pantry. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow over the room stacked with canned goods, bread crates, and worn-out volunteers. Grace tied her apron behind her back and joined the line, quietly handing out bags of groceries to a stream of strangers with stories she'd never fully know. She hadn't planned to be here. She had just stopped by to drop off a few items. But when the director said, "We're short-staffed today, could use a few extra hands," something in her heart replied before her lips did. "Sure, I'll stay." An hour passed. Then 2. That's when Teresa arrived. She looked young, but her eyes were ancient. One child on her hip, another tugging at her coat. She apologized for being short-tempered, said she was running on 2 hours of sleep and even less hope. Grace knelt to the child's level, smiled, and said softly, "You're doing better than you think." Teresa looked up. His eyes brimmed. A single tear slipped out. "No one ever says that to me," she whispered. "Thank you." Then came Joe, a man with a Marine Corps patch on his sleeve and no home to return to. He didn't take the groceries right away, just stared at the floor. "I used to have a house," he said out of nowhere. "Used to pray a lot too. Back before things fell apart." Grace didn't offer cliches. She didn't force conversation. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "God didn't forget you, Joe. You're still here. That means something." He looked up with misty eyes and nodded as if her words had touched something he thought long dead. And in that moment it hit her. You weren't assigned to tasks, you were assigned to people. This was the work. This was the altar. This was the holy place where obedience didn't look like performance. It looked like presence. Grace realized her calling wasn't limited to any role, church, or job description. It was in every table she stood behind, every hand she held, every moment she let someone feel seen. She remembered Galatians 6:2. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. That didn't require a seminary degree. It required a surrendered heart. She left that pantry tired, but filled. Not because she fixed anyone, but because she showed up. And that day, heaven whispered, over her soul. There is no such thing as small obedience. Every act of love moves eternity. Part 9. You're not weak, you're targeted. A small-town church revival service, dim lights, altar full of seeker. The sanctuary was packed that night, not with celebrities or cameras, but with hungry hearts. The kind of people who didn't come for performance. They came for presence. Grace almost didn't go. She'd sat in her car for a full 10 minutes staring at the building, debating whether to walk in. She wasn't sure she belonged in a room filled with loud worship and bold declarations. But something whispered, "You don't need to feel worthy to walk into holy places. You just need to be willing." So she stepped in. The worship was deep, not flashy. The message cut through her like a blade dipped in oil. You're not being attacked because you're weak. You're being attacked because you're anointed. That line didn't just resonate. It unlocked something. Suddenly, all her warfare made sense. The emotional breakdowns, the mental spirals, the financial sabotage, the isolation that made her feel like a ghost in her own life. It wasn't proof she had failed. It was proof she was carrying something hell feared. The preacher's voice rose. No one breaks into an empty vault. If you've been under pressure, it's because you hold something valuable. Grace wept. Not the elegant kind, the soul-purging, mascara-streaked kind. And then it happened. At the altar, a young woman fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. People passed her by, unsure what to do. Grace moved without thinking. She knelt beside her, placed a hand on her back and whispered, "You're not crazy. You're chosen." The girl, her name was Maya, grabbed onto her and cried even harder. No sermon, no altar call, just a moment. A sacred collision between two wounded vessels, and the God who still poured through them. Later, Maya whispered, "Whatever you said, something broke off me." And Grace knew it wasn't her eloquence, it was her obedience, because she wasn't weak. She was targeted, and every storm, every scar, every sleepless night was not a sign of failure. It was evidence of calling. As she left the church that night, she remembered 2 Corinthians 4:8-9. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. She had lived those words, and now she carried them not as theory, but as testimony. Part 10. Finish it. For them. Grace's living room, candle-lit desk late at night. The house was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, the kind that feels sacred. Grace sat at her desk, a candle flickering beside her journal, the same journal she once filled with questions. Now she was ready to write the answer. She stared at the blank page. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat. All day, she'd felt the prompting. Tell your story. It's time. But fear crept in again, the old voices. Who are you to write anything? No one cares what you've been through. You're not qualified. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she heard her grandmother's voice. Soft, strong, sacred. Baby, you're not writing for applause. You're writing for someone's breakthrough. And just like that, the dam broke. She began to write. Not as a performer, but as a survivor. Not from a platform, but from a prayer closet. She wrote about the pain, the delays, the nights she wanted to quit. She wrote about the whisper that stopped her from ending her life. About the letter she let the wind carry. About the way God found her in attics, in classrooms, in food pantries, in the sound of a child reading again. And as she typed the final sentence, tears streamed freely. I'm still here, not because I'm strong, but because I'm sent. She hit post, not to go viral, but to obey. And somewhere miles away, a woman who was about to give up on life read the words and whispered, "Maybe I'll try one more day." Grace didn't hear it, but heaven did. Because obedience doesn't always echo in your ears. Sometimes it echoes in eternity. She blew out the candle. laid her head down, and slept deeply, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was aligned. She had not lived a flawless life, but she had answered the call, not just for herself, but for the ones waiting on her yes, for the ones who needed to see that it's still possible to be broken and still used, to be attacked and still anointed, to feel afraid and still finish. You were born to finish. The next morning, the sun rose quiet over the fields. Grace stood on the same back porch where she once whispered, "Why am I still here?" But today, the silence didn't sting. It soothed, because she finally understood. She hadn't survived the crash, the heartbreak, the depression, or the delay because she was lucky. She had survived because she was assigned. Every battle had a purpose. Every scar had a name. Every moment she almost gave up, heaven held the line. Why? Because she hadn't finished yet, and neither have you. If you're still standing after all these years, if you've walked through fire but refused to fold, if your voice shakes but you still speak, if your heart aches but you still hope, then hear this in your spirit. You are not forgotten, you are commissioned. The enemy didn't fight you over your past. He fought you because of your future, but he failed, because here you are, reading these words, breathing still, burning still, chosen still. You are the living proof that purpose outlives pain. So pick up your assignment again, not because you're perfect, but because you said yes. Pick it up for your children. Pick it up for your healing. Pick it up for the girl you used to be and the woman still watching you. Because your life is not just about you. It is a lifeline for someone else's survival. The righteous fall 7 times, but they rise again. To rise, finish the holy task. And when the enemy asks why he couldn't take you out, let your life answer, because I had something sacred still left to do. Your survival is evidence of your assignment. You are not still breathing by accident. You are breathing because heaven still has business through you. Delay is not denial. God has been growing your roots while you thought he was silent. Obedience is your loudest sermon. Your light doesn't need a stage, just a surrendered heart. You're not weak, you're targeted. The battle around you reveals the weight of what you carry. Your story isn't just yours. Someone's freedom is waiting on your testimony. If this story stirred something inside you, if a single sentence whispered confirmation into your soul, if you've been carrying the weight of wondering, why am I still here? Let this be your declaration. Drop these words in the comments right now. I will finish my assignment. Say it boldly. Say it like a contract. Say it like you're signing your name on heaven's scroll. And if you believe this message was sent from heaven with your name on it, share it with someone else who needs to remember. They're not dying, they're becoming. If you're still standing after everything, type, I'm still standing by grace. And finally, if you believe this mission deserves to continue, and you want to be part of the miracle, let God lead you to support the journey. You were born to finish, and by the grace of God, you will. Until next time, stay surrendered, stay steady, and stay lit with purpose. God bless you.